And thank you to Alex and Kate for inviting me to give this morning's talk. So I'll be talking about my PhD study, which is the same title as the presentation, what counts as happiness for young people. Right from my kind of like undergraduate dissertation through to my master's and then my PhD, I've been very interested in adolescent well-being, adolescent happiness, relationships with parents, with friends, self-esteem. And this was a real opportunity for me in my PhD to kind of think about some of the ways that we conceptualize young people's happiness, and also to think about the methods that we research happiness with young people. And I developed a new method to research young people's happiness, which I'll be talking about in my presentation this morning. So yes, again, thank you for the invite, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some existing research on young people's happiness. And I'll be thinking about how is happiness conceptualized, particularly within psychology. And what does this mean then for how or even whether we can measure happiness? And whether such existing measurements that we have of, particularly for children and young people's happiness, do they allow for young people's own views on what happiness is for them? So as I just mentioned on the previous slide, I'm going to be talking through a new method that I developed for investigating young people's happiness, which uses what I called happiness maps. I'll be telling you about some key findings that my study revealed. The first is that actually for young people in my study, happiness was very wide-ranging and it was individually variable. The second is that actually when they spoke about the things that they associated with what made them happy, they were all qualified. You know, sometimes those things didn't always make them happy. They were contingent. They were contingent on getting on well together with other people. They were contingent on their mood. They were contingent on the time. And also, importantly, that when young people spoke about their happiness, they also spoke about this in terms of unhappiness as well. Language of unhappiness was also very much associated with happiness. And I'll be considering what are the implications of this? What's the implications of the methodological approach that I took? What's the implications of the findings for understanding young people's happiness? And lastly, I'll be considering some limitations of my study and some possible future directions as well. So the good thing is that happiness research is growing. There's an annual World Happiness Day on the 20th of March. There's actually an annual Global Happiness Report. And encouragingly, recently, we've begun to see international research on happiness. And this sort of has looked at indicators of child well-being, subjective well-being, and compared these between countries. But the UK hasn't been faring so well. So in 2007, UNICEF commissioned a report, and this was 21 wealthy industrialized nations. And they were measured on 6 indices of child well-being, and the UK was bottom. By 2013, the UK had improved a little bit, but we were still only 16th out of 29 countries. And in terms of actually incorporating children's well-being into measures of child well-being, this is reflected in the UK government's approach from 2010. They developed the National Wellbeing Project, and they rely quite heavily on statistics from the Office of National Statistics. And in terms of the contribution for the metrics for children and young people's well-being, a lot of this is supplied through the Children's Society, through things like their Good Childhood reports. And they've been researching UK's children's well-being since 2009. and they've worked with over 60,000 children between the ages of 8 and 18, predominantly quantitative, but some qualitative approaches as well. And unfortunately, the similar findings to the UNICEF reports are echoed in this, that actually children's happiness in the UK has been declining. There still remain some fundamental debates about what happiness is and how best to research it. Some of this concerns a real lack of conceptual clarity. So you'll often find in subjective well-being research or in happiness research terms like life satisfaction or flourishing or happiness or subjective well-being used and actually used interchangeably and used to talk about young people's happiness. But perhaps most of this research on children's happiness is concerned with the determinants of well-being rather than actually what young people understand by the term happiness. Thinking about the approach that psychology takes to thinking about well-being, children's well-being, it favours eudaimonism, or other words, flourishing, over hedonism, which we can briefly think about in terms of maximising comfort or minimising pain. So there's a model that we can look at to discuss what this might look like overall. So on the left, we have what's termed hedonic subjective well-being. And this very much follows Diener, so Ed Diener, a very famous researcher in this area. His conceptualization that actually there's two core components, one of cognition and one of affect. And the cognitive component is generally measured by things like either a judgment of life satisfaction as a whole, so as a single domain, or as a series of subdomains. And there's an example here, excuse me, sorry, from the Good Childhood Index. So this is used in the Good Childhood reports by the Children's Society, and they might typically ask young people to rate their satisfaction with life or with their family or with their school, their friends and so on. And then we have this affective component. And typically in well-being research, if affect is taken into account, it's concentrated on positive affect. But there are explanations of variance in subjective well-being which are actually unexplained. And we don't really understand what underpins achieving high satisfaction. And then on the right-hand side of this model, we have the eudaimonic or psychological well-being approach to understanding well-being from this perspective. And this is based on Rees research. So this drew very much on theories of optimal, positive functioning, lifespan development. So this encompasses things like positive relationships with others, autonomy, and achieving purpose in life. And this emphasis on effective functioning very much reflects this eudaimonic approach to kind of like happiness, as opposed to kind of like the hedonic approach, which is often centered on, say, a simple thing of feeling good. And then what you have had in recent research is this idea of flourishing. So this is taking a measure of subjective well-being. It typically might be something like rate how satisfied you are in your life overall, or rate how happy you were yesterday, and rate to what extent you feel that you have purpose in life. And those two are combined and then used to give an indication of whether somebody is flourishing or not. But in terms of measuring children's and young people's subjective well-being or their happiness, there are some potential issues. So in 2014, Ravens and Seaborough, they looked to actually incorporate children's views into a model of subjective well-being. But first of all, They did a literature scope and they found that there were 92 measures of child's subjective well-being. So this indicates that actually there's a lack of agreement in what subjective well-being is, or perhaps how to measure it. So they were mindful of the fact that actually maybe some of these conceptualizations of child well-being reflect adult models, and that we ought to do something like incorporating children's views. So they took 3 subdomains of child subjective well-being. They took life satisfaction, positive effect, and meaning and purpose. But actually, they only asked children questions which aligned with those existing constructs. And when children spoke about negative effect, or when they spoke about aspects of their well-being that didn't fit into this model, they were excluded from the model because they entirely wanted to concentrate on positive aspects of well-being. And this is one of the examples in which these conceptualizations don't allow for children and young people's views about their well-being to be heard, and how the role of emotions is often overlooked. And this is despite actually researchers like Ahmed, like Huta and Viterso, recognizing that emotions are very important, and that actually both positive and negative emotions are important to well-being. It may reflect actually that measuring emotions is quite difficult. It's more kind of like ephemeral, harder to pin down. But perhaps something needs to be done about this. Perhaps some of the measures that we are using need to be sensitive enough to actually capture what children think and believe. And that this kind of like is important, because if we are interested in young people's happiness, their well-being, their feelings about their lives, then we need to think about how we are investigating this. Another thing that's happened is this kind of downplaying of happiness in favour of flourishing. So in this first quote here, this was taken from the foreword to the Good Childhood report produced by the Children's Society. So it says, though it is easy to slip into a shorthand of happiness, well-being is about so much more than this. It's about how young people feel about their lives as a whole, how they feel about their relationships, the amount of choice they have in their lives and their future. But what this assumes is that actually, when young people are talking about their happiness, it doesn't encompass all of these things. And that actually, in the small but growing body of literature that has begun to ask children and young people about their happiness, this has started to reveal that how they think about happiness is a much richer conceptualization than this simple emotion of just feeling good. People are talking about, their future, their expectations, the relationships that they have. All of these actually are important when young people are thinking about their happiness. So we're slowly moving towards the recognition that it is really important to take a child-centred perspective on happiness and subjective well-being. And this aligns with recommendation from the Childhood Wellbeing Research Centre that children's voices on their well-being need to be incorporated fully into well-being research, and also reflects, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that children need to participate and their views and opinions are really important and they need to be listened to. And also the perspective that children's lives are of intrinsic interest in themselves. They don't necessarily just need to be considered in relation to adult concerns. So how might we do this? Well, we might do this by thinking about the kind of approaches that we use to investigate young people's happiness and well-being. And in this way, using things like sensitive qualitative approaches might enable children to explore these meanings of their happiness and can facilitate our understanding of what happiness means for them. And this was kind of like the fundamental approach that I wanted to take with my PhD. So what did my study involve? Well, I researched with 42 young people. They were aged 13 to 16. So a lot of research has shown that actually young people's happiness and well-being is at its lowest around the ages of 14 to 15. And that's why I was particularly interested in researching with this age group. So there were two phases to my study. The first phase was working with some Year 9 students and some Year 10 students. They were studying psychology and sociology, so we need to think about some of the implications of that. And they did this first phase in their lesson time, so I went into the schools and they did a short happiness writing task, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. And then this was followed up by them completing their happiness map and writing some reflections on this. And then 6 months later, I went back into the schools to conduct the second phase. So this was 2 discussion groups initially. And so we explored some themes and some questions which had arisen from their writings on happiness and their happiness maps. And then lastly, I conducted 4 in-depth individual interviews. And this was kind of centered on young people's experiences of their happiness. And this was divided up into a kind of 3-part time frame. So they talked about their happiness when they were a child. They talked about their experiences of happiness in the present. And they also talked about how and if happiness featured in their expectations for the future. I analysed the data following broad principles of constructivist grounded theory. So this assumes that people can and they do think about their lives and their actions. They're not just responding to mechanical stimuli. So the kind of methods this involves is a simultaneous iterative process of data collection and analysis. It concentrates on things like actions and processes, and it develops conceptual and analytic categories, which are then taken forward developed into themes. So it bears some considerable resemblance to thematic analysis, but it very much acknowledges the role of the researcher in this process. Okay, so the first phase, as I mentioned, is the happiness map. But just as kind of prelude to this, their writing task that they were given was to write down everything that they associated with happiness. So there were some prompts that were suggested. So I said you could consider anything that you associate with your happiness. It might be to do with people. It might be to do with friends. It might be to do with things that you like doing. So just write down a list of anything you associate with being happy. And then I invited them to complete this happiness map. So this is a series of concentric circles. So the person is in the middle, and then in the inner circle closest to them are the things that are most important to their happiness. And so then as we move out through these series of concentric circles, they're less salient to their happiness, but they're still part of their happiness. So as you can see in this example here, the things that were most important to this participant's happiness was their family, their friends, going to concerts. They were really looking forward to a gap year, going to Australia, helping people, food, music, and sleeping. And then when we look on the outer circle, we've got things like playing guitar, Ben and Jerry's ice cream, talking, a group that they liked, Green Day, and so on. And then the last part of this was for them to reflect on their happiness map. So I invited them to tell me a little bit about why they had positioned some things closer to the center of the happiness map, or why some things were further apart. In which ways did these contribute to their happiness? And was there anything that they wanted to say about these particular items that they'd chosen? And then, as I say, I followed these up 6 months later. So there were lots of data from this with the discussion groups and then with the individual interviews. So the first thing that I found was that it was a very wide range of things that were associated with happiness. 672 things were included on these happiness maps. And what was really striking was that half of them were only mentioned once or twice. So it was a huge range and it was very individual. But there were some things that were really frequently mentioned. So the most frequently mentioned was family members. And the second most frequently mentioned was friends. And then young people talked a lot about the things that they liked doing, particularly sport-related things. They talked a lot about foods that they like to eat, music that they liked to listen to, and then the pets and their animals. There's some phrases here from where I asked people to reflect on their happiness maps. So we can see that we've got a wide range of things to do with enjoyment, things to do with feeling close to other people, being connected, bonding, being funny, feeling appreciated, having special moments, feeling relaxed, and so on. So some really nice reflections here on their happiness maps. But these were also some of the words that were used by the young people reflecting on their happiness maps. So we can see here that when young people are talking about the kind of things that make them happy and their associations with happiness, they're talking in terms sometimes of language that relates to feeling lonely, that relates to feeling scared, that relates to feeling depressed and feeling down. And this was a real indication for me that actually happiness is far more complex than existing conceptualizations will allow for. That actually happiness, the things that they associated with happiness, were also associated with unhappiness. And this was something that I really wanted to explore a little bit in the follow-up phases. So in terms of these key findings then, first, obviously, that I've been speaking about, that happiness is wide-ranging and individually variable. So I put the question to the discussion groups, what does happiness mean? And this was actually quite difficult, particularly for the younger group to answer. So they were now in year 10. So they were aged 14 to 15 at that time. And they did kind of struggle to answer this question. It's quite complex to think about this. And then for the year 11 group, they still found it challenging, but they were able to explore it in a little bit more detail. So you can see some examples of these from Jordan and Daniel here. So what Jordan is saying, well, it's a joyous state of mind. I mean, it's different for everybody. You can't define what happiness is. It comes under so many different definitions. You can't just stick them to one thing. There's many things that make different people happy. And there's a lot of things that make people happy that make other people sad. And I don't think you can really define something that means something that big. And then Daniel's also recognizing this, actually, that you've got a completely different view of what makes you happy than everybody else around you. And this was something that came out through a lot of these discussions on happiness, that they recognized that actually happiness encompassed all sorts of things. It encompassed memories, it encompassed feelings, it encompassed individual experiences. but they really recognized that this was very individual, and that what made one person happy made another person sad. The next thing that came out was that actually happiness is qualified and contingent. So on this slide here, I've got some examples of where people were talking about this on their happiness maps, or in their reflections on their happiness maps. So they're talking about things or people that are really important to their happiness, but they don't make them happy all of the time. So we've got an example here from Becky. Friends, most of the time I love them, but sometimes I want to slap them. And then a lot of things here which indicate that this is contingent. You know, these people only make me happy when we're getting on well together, only when we're not arguing or no one's angry. I love my friends and family, but sometimes they cause me sadness. So they also talked about this contingent nature of happiness in relation to particular times, in relation to the mood that they were in at that time. So you couldn't necessarily say that these things in their lives always made them happy in every circumstance. How this was really emphasized was in relationships with family and friends. And also something that came out was that family could represent lots of different things to lots of different people. So Becky here is talking about 3 aspects of her family. These were on her happiness maps and on her reflections on her happiness maps. So on the one hand, she's saying, family, I love them unconditionally. And then she's talking about specific relationships. You know, brother from another mother, love them, but sometimes I really want to push them in a ditch. And then she's talking about an activity that she does with her dad, soapbox derby. I have a really good time spending time with my dad. And we'll come back to the kind of like the implications of what research like this, or what this method might illuminate in terms of these different relationships that all constitute family. But a lot of the time when people were talking about the good aspects of their positive relationships with their family, they were talking about feelings of love. They were talking about feelings of attachment, family bonds, shared interests and activities. And it was that which was associated with their happiness. But also, they began to talk about the relationship with their happiness, with their family, as something that was changing over time. And they began to compare how their family contributed to their happiness with how their friends contributed with their happiness. And we can see an example of this here from Holly. She's saying, it's like you get a negative aura around your family sometimes. It's like I talked to my dad about sixth form and college. I just get like negative feelings because I feel like something bad will be brought up. But if I talk about it with friends, it will be positive because they all believe in me. And other young people spoke about this as well. They talked about their family holding on to these long-standing ideas that they had about them from when they were much younger, these expectations that they had. And these really kind of, they felt very negative. They felt much more unsupportive. And they were turning more to their friends for that kind of relational support and contributing to their happiness. So we can see an illustration of this here, that friends know how to make you happy, says Emily. And then Isabel agrees with her. Yeah, whereas families sometimes don't understand where you're coming from. Someone the same age as you, like going through the same stuff. They were talking about friends being much more supportive, friends going out of their way to make them happy when they realized that they weren't happy. This is the kind of thing that friends would be doing, and they were contrasting that with family. But interestingly enough, there were also aspects of their friendships which were much more difficult. So some of the young people spoke about if they would have arguments with their friends, and and they didn't get on with people. And if there was a particularly bad argument, they felt really unwell. They didn't want to go to school that day. They couldn't face going into school and seeing their friends. And then there was an interesting exchange. So just to give you a little bit of background to the quote that's on this slide, Jordan was in the year 11 group, and he was there with his friend Daniel. But Jordan had moved schools a couple of years beforehand, and he was still friends with somebody from his old school. And he started talking about this friend, Bradley. And then Daniel said, unfortunately, a twat, as soon as he mentioned the name Bradley. And the rest of the group kind of just started laughing. And so what Jordan had to do was he had to shift his allegiance away from Bradley towards this new group of friends. So this is what he's doing here. He's talking about Bradley, and he's saying, you know, obviously I don't depend on him to be happy, but he used to, and he still does, and I can't see me ever not being friends with him. Obviously I won't be friends with him at one point in my life, as opposed to most people that I know now, like in 10 years or so from now. But for now, I'm glad that I have a certain group of friends that I can rely on to make me happy, which is, and then he sort of tailed off. So this relationship with their friends, they're really important. They do contribute to their happiness, but they are also relationships that need to be negotiated. Sometimes these relationships can make them unhappy as well. There's these unspoken rules and allegiances in these relationships with their friends. And I mentioned, we saw on that initial slide from the reflections on the happiness maps about this language of unhappiness included in their discussions of happiness. So it was talked about in relation to everyday things such as food, things that they like doing, such as, you know, singing, but, you know, if they had stage fright, it made them feel really stressed. They talked about things like having a lack of self-confidence. And they talked about things that even, you know, if they like doing them, you know, Holly's talking here, I love drawing. Most of the time I draw, but sometimes I'll get sad when I draw. And even if I draw, I just won't get happy. It's got worse. So this is very much part of this language when they're talking about the things that make them happy. It's this language of unhappiness as well. So I think that what my findings show overall is that happiness for young people is really individually variable. It's far more wide-ranging than those existing conceptualizations of happiness allow for. So engaging with these kind of qualitative methods that I've used, they show that actually things like relationships with family and friends are important to their happiness, but these relationships are contingent. So although they loved their family and friends, they could also make them sad and angry. So these most popular things, or the most frequently mentioned things that they talked about, family, friends, music, sport, food and pets, they do support some of these view studies that have also incorporated children's views on their happiness. And to date, these have been predominantly small-scale studies, much like my study as well. But what this shows is that actually how and why these things are important to their lives, and not just, you know, happiness with family, rating how happy you are with family, for instance. We saw in that example where Becky was talking about actually family encompasses lots of different things. It talks about activities with one particular person. It talks about love for a family overall. It talks about feelings for a particular member of the family. These are much more complex than are captured in these existing models. And I've been talking a lot about this language of unhappiness and how that was associated with happiness. And the important thing is that if this is the way, this kind of discourse is how people are talking, young people are talking about their happiness, then happiness research and theoretical models should reflect this. We shouldn't just ignore it because it doesn't fit in to these adult-led or adult-constructed models that we have of young people's happiness and well-being. We need to rethink this theory. We need to rethink the ways of approaching research in this area. There were some limitations for my study. So firstly, girls were those who predominantly engaged in reflection on their happiness maps. So that you remember that at the beginning, young people were invited to talk about why those things that they put them on their happiness maps, you know, why do they put things closer or further away on those series of concentric circles. But there were a number of people who didn't do that reflection on those happiness maps. So of the 7 who chose not to do the reflection, 5 of those were boys aged 15. And this means that understanding how or why certain things made boys around the age of 15 happy was more difficult because they didn't tend to expand, they didn't tend to talk about those. And actually this echoes findings by researchers like Tatlo Guerin. So she's done a lot of research on adolescent self-concept, and she's found that talking is far more salient for girls than it is for boys. So maybe there's some consideration here, you know, what the other methods might need to be employed to help boys to, you know, reflect or to talk a little bit more about why these things are important to their happiness. The other limitation was actually how I had to conduct the research. So I mentioned that it was in a school. So when the children did the initial writing tasks and the happiness maps, these were done within their normal lesson time. But then when it came to the discussion groups and the individual interviews, the school insisted that these had to take place either in a school classroom or in fact, even in the staff room. And a member of staff had to be present. So they weren't part of the discussion, but they were there quite clearly in the room. And I think that this would have an effect on the freedom, you know, which the young people felt that they had to discuss these things. And this is one aspect of, you know, that can often occur in researching in environments like schools, these tightly controlled spaces. So this was a potential limitation of my study. But I think it does pave the way for some future directions. It would be important and interesting to engage in some longitudinal studies in how these meanings of happiness change over time. We started to see that when young people were talking about things like their relationships with their family and friends and how that contributed to their happiness and how that changed over time. But I also saw it in where young people were talking about happiness being so much more simple when they were younger. It could be such as, you know, being given a nice toy or something nice to eat. And actually, as they got older, it got more complex. So a longitudinal study would be really interesting to explore how these meanings of happiness change over time. It would also be important, I think, to conduct this research in a variety of social contexts. So I've talked about the limitations of researching, particularly in this sort of gatekeeper environment within the school setting. And I think it would be important to research in lots of different areas. But also there is a potential, I think, with this happiness maps to use that in schools, to use it with different age groups, to explore happiness, to open up those discussions about what is important to young people's happiness. Can use this with younger children as well as older children. And I think particularly in you know, the current situation, we're still kind of like in the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has had a huge impact on young people's happiness, on their well-being. So using something like happiness to help happiness maps and these kind of methods to explore this, I think would be highly beneficial. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.